Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is fourth in a series of 8 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 2. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to scan the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. All of them will help you understand this and those following it. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score, on the first stave of page 108, as the giants hotly press for their wage. 2 giant thumps, their fourths buttressed by octavo tubas, energize Fasold's answer, Kein anderer, Freya allein, to a falling octave and Albrecht's lustfully taunting module. The giant thump becomes 2 measures of a hasty ascent of falling thirds and rising fourths, which piano arrangements routinely confuse thanks to the semiquaver cello-viola doubling, muddying the fact they echo Fasold's previous description of the giant's labors on Valhalla. Alternating with tubas, horns reinforce the chains of rising air to fourths as Fafnir moves to grab Freya, calling on her to a falling third, then a fourth in a reverse ash interval. This unleashes a measure of 2 rising-falling signs on string semiquavers, which in the next become 4 upward racing scale arpeggios, as Freya cries for help, rising then falling on thirds then fifths, a kind of shadow iteration of the abandonment triad. With her, strings hurry to climax on downward semiquaver arpeggios in crotchet bundles that rise across the diminished 7th harmony, their resemblance to ring fragments increasing the dramatic tension. Octavo trombones assist by pounding static giant thumps beneath this measure, then, with the next, shift to forward-rushing quaver impacts, all assisted by a swelling horn-high woodwind pedal. Over them, strings fall in 2 more semiquaver arpeggios, to dip then rise on a sextuplet arpeggio that becomes an ascending scale, making another unnatural sign to announce the tardy entrance of Freya's brothers, who, per stage instructions, scoop her up out of danger. Volkswagen doesn't bother with an example of the fanfare announcing Fro, though he says it reproduces the Apple's morpheme as a sort of merry war song, and Kobe agrees. Newman pays it no attention, but Hutchison replicates its first measure while admitting it's only derived from the theme of the apples. Cook, Spencer Millington, and Sabor pass it over without comment, since, given it recurs only in Rheingold, it doesn't qualify as a morpheme in the proper sense, while, like Hutchison, Holman offers an example of its initial strophe. The material's primary falling-rising sign pulse certainly arises from the apple's syntax, as it reproduces intact its reverse melody note portion, holds its last note as a dotted crotchet, and, omitting the apple's third at its lowest point, instead produces it as a 4th fall and rise. It then moves through the air to chord note opposition turn to give its full ash interval as an overarching air to 4th. From that point, the similarities are tangential, as it continues down a Welterbe triad into a reverse ash interval on reverse chord notes, 2 syntactic marks of Fro's racial hopes. After this, it forsakes all resemblance to the apples as it slides up then down, then twice up again in a series of quasi-military tattoos, all orchestrated in horns woodwinds, 2 trumpets emphasizing its initial module, then tapering off in punctuations which end on 2 widely separate Valhalla ash intervals. Primarily following the 4-square harmony, Fro's vocal leaps up a third, then after a crotchet rest falls threateningly on a 5th, to the name Freya. After another crotchet pause, he wards off Fafnir with an inverted ash interval on a 6th, followed by melody notes, making the phrase a defiant pulse with its sense of plucky resistance. Rather ambivalently, after a minim rest, he offers his protection by dropping a third into a low ash interval on a fourth, only to finish by plunging an unpromising but defiant fifth on Schöne. The brass woodwind accompaniment, which reproduces these intervals in minims, gives them at least the outward appearance of noble strength. Donner, Freya's other tardy male sibling, sings on Fro's heels, prefaced by a timpani roll beneath aggressive massed string triplet quavers. The first ended with a falling fourth to continue on reverse chord notes. It's a subtle reminder of the double impacts which enervate Fasold's initial shock at Wotan's duplicity. This one measure of walking bass tails into a sextuplet semi-quaver natural sign, which abruptly ends, leaving timpani alone to bang out a Valhalla ash interval, a sonic portrayal of the Thunderer's famed hammer swing as he threatens the Giant Brothers. A cappella, he barks static notes, the word Fafnir on a falling octave to leap up a seventh into an energetic Rheinmaiden pulse on a rising sixth, whose operative syntax is the Welterbe triad, the Thunderer asserting his godly race's sexual prerogative. Atop harsh staccato crotchet timpani string chord jabs, his marcato crotchet line descends another octave on hammers, leaps up another seventh, then down a sixth, to finish magisterially on a rising air to fourth. As the string crotchet softened to staccato along with the timpani roll, Fafnir chides Donner with three static notes capped by a plunging fifth, while with greater nobility, Fasold argues they've come for pay, not a fight, his vocal rising on reverse chord notes to descend in an answering fifth. After a dotted minim rest, during which horns, cellos sound two giant thumps, soft low-string minims support his rise on more reverse chord notes, into his own Rheinmaiden strophe on a rising fourth to counter Donner's. Two more giant thumps punctuate him on horns, and to a pair of string minim chords, he rises on heroic melody notes to end with the chastening defiance module. This triggers an exact repeat of the Thunderer's immediately prior hammer blow syntax as he prepares to smite the Giant Brothers, crowing a cappella how he's done it before on a rising third and plunging sixth that lifts a tritone into an outline of Flosshilda's heroism, the direct opposite of Fasold's immediately prior defiance module, thus hinting at the two cells' coming syntactic rolls. Violin's cellos begin thrice-repeated trill appoggiatura launched downward chromatic semiquaver scales, echoed by violas on rising ones, all punctuated with marcato quaver strokes on horns, bassoons, timpani. While this bundle rises in scalar harmony, Donner sinks a third through a reverse ash interval to immediately lift a fourth into a low, elided to another reverse, falling a third directly on its heels, all marks of his ambivalent powers. After a quaver rest, he concludes to a pair of static pulses separated by a downward third, ended in a bold rising fourth. He prepares to strike as massed strings crescendo in two trill appoggiatura-launched rising scales, while horn woodwind timpani quaver punctuations double in speed to outline a pair ghosting the fourth ascents from the giant's labors. Only now does Wotan impose his spear, its morpheme launched on a booming major chord, heavy and brass, punctuated by a semiquaver arpeggio rising giant-like on trumpets, after which thunderous octavo trombones march down the morpheme proper. Once they slow to crotchets, his imperious vocal warning reverses the heroic melody notes, whose middle pitches he shapes as an inverted ash interval, from which he rises after three static notes on a heroic fifth. This freezes trombones in a breve pedal, fading to end held as a crotchet. With the upbeat, the god's voice rises more gently in an air to fourth as octavo low strings replace trombones, to creep down a brooding chromatic scale of extended reverse melody notes, themselves nascent racial syntax, during which Wotan declares, "Der Träger schützt meine Speereschaft," a rich irony, since it's the god's deliberate breach of the present treaty which precipitates this brawl. His resolute vocal syntax bristles with his ambivalent power base, a series of 3 contiguous whirl-dash intervals, a low rising a third, a swifter reverse that falls in at a fourth, then another low on a third. During his semi-brevi pause, phrasing of the scale in octavo low strings resembling reverse melody notes, a sly whisper of his racial dreams at the root of his decisiveness. He finishes by ordering Donner to put down his hammer, rising a fourth, which, launched by a muted crotchet string chord, he caps with keen syntactic insight on a falling tritone and reverse chord notes. Though the spear has already been heard 7 times, virtually from the very beginning of Scene 2, with 2 fairly rousing versions as Fasolt protests Wotan's duplicity, this iteration is effectively its first definitive statement, one which echoes more powerfully on trumpets the bold rising string arpeggio cell that launches it when Fasolt questions whether the immortal himself believes in its authority. Wotan's use of the weapon here, combined with his words, leave no doubt the morpheme applies not to treaties but the spear's power in enforcing them. For one, zwischen die Streitenden ausstreckend is one piece of stage business no production ever neglects. The god's spear, in fact, is among the few props to vary little between a host of stage interpretations over the years. While Donner's hammer is portrayed as everything from a gun to a croquet mallet, Wotan's spear is invariably a long shaft, one which, in all but a few cases, is tipped with a blade. That it's imposed here to break up a fight is reason enough to conclude it's more than just a symbol of treaties. The immortal's words are equally definitive, declaring the spear shoots, contracts, automatically making it something more than the packs themselves. Freya certainly grasps the point. A timpani roll swelling as cellos lift in quavers, fingered as semiquavers, a distortion of her initial module at the top of which the timpani quiet, so violin, viola, tremolos, and a solitary horn pedal may cushion her lament over Wotan's abandonment. After a first cry of Vehe on static notes, her second pulse sinks pathetically in chord notes, moving to her lament proper on another chord note strophe, whose lower note repeats a static ash interval, making the entire line, underpinned by tremolo first violins, an embryonic suggestion of resignation, but for its mournful conclusion on a falling third. Into the bargain, the syntax implies 2 nascent ideas. Freya's line disguises a Welterbe triad, while string tremolos outline leisurely reverse Erde melody notes, both modules destined to mark Wotan's plans of racial hegemony. At this point it may be unclear how his scheme will develop, yet its seeds are progressively being laid nonetheless. Fricka backs her sister, syntactically reinforcing the underlying reason for this betrayal as she voices her own disbelief to a Welterbe triad and another resignation strophe, both couched as ash intervals. The first a dire inverted, the second a reverse. Once she falls silent, resignation echoes yet again on first clarinet, complete with its reverse ash interval over a swelling viola trill appoggiatura, the resignation pair underlined by the ominous frisson of a timpani roll. In a single stroke, the Meister combines 3 of the work's most pungent racial sexual morphemes, shot through with whirl-dash power on the lips and in the orchestral accompaniment surrounding Valhalla's only 2 females, the whole veiled in Erde's shadow, the work's 3rd key female divinity. It's a suitable introduction for the Earth Mother's henchman, who at last obligingly appears. While essential to the plot, the prior wrangles depend upon, thus are subservient to, one element which charges the first half of Scene 2 with dramatic tension, that being the anxious wait for a tardy Loge. The news he brings once he appears, along with its implications, drive the scene's remainder, never mind the rest of this first chapter and the tetralogy as a whole. As Newman observes, when the fire god finally does materialize, the musical texture at last begins to hint at something like the dense wealth of expression in the epic's last chapter. Loge's stage bow, rife with insidious chromaticism, recalls those hints from Scene 1 already discussed. This is not to say the Meister entirely throws over his device of stops and starts, quasi-recitative alternated with symphonic passages. Rather, he contrasts the active power of nature, as now embodied in Loge's physical presence, with the anti-natural dealings of the gods with the giants, as befits the scene's criss-cross lines of feint and counterfeint. Not until Loge's famed panegyric do the riches of Scene 1 again flood and stabilize the music, a structural technique which throws intense weight of meaning onto that episode. The fire god is announced by all his morphemic material in succession, a remarkable detail since Wagner rarely concentrates in as brief a space of time so much varied syntax associated with any one character or idea. Valhalla's morphemes are another notable case, though most audiences don't distinguish its four primary modules from one another. The fire sprite's 5 separate and distinct modules, however, strike even the most casual ear as distinctly unique, each of them serving a host of different purposes throughout the epic in a multifarious kaleidoscope of guises, sign of the character's narrative importance, never mind his quicksilver personality. Shaw noticed, but erroneously dismissed it as Wagner having tired of his syntax by the time of Götterdämmerung. As Loge enters, cellos, violas sweep up 3 measures of his rising reverse chord note bundle to linger a measure on one of its chord note cells, then another 2 of its rising chromatic scales, as Wotan vents his relief with a static ash interval, its capping downward fifth a subtle mark of the god's vulnerability. 2 measures of Loge's chord note tremolo lead to its swift minor-major version of the Erde chords, outlined by high woodwinds, pizzicato violins, embellished by playful rising-falling violin twitches, and a third cadential measure, itself a reflection of the Erde chords. Over these 3 measures, Wotan scolds Loge's tardy arrival to cure his schlimmen Handel. The immortal's vocal does no more than hastily leap up and down tonic triad notes, though sketching a plunging fifth in the process as well as a rising, which incidentally finishes that lusting module from Albrecht's Scene 1 vocal, then a downward fourth to end on reverse chord notes and a rising third. As the god falls silent, cellos, violas race down 3 measures of Loge's Erde chord note module, only to repeat a single measure of its reversals, as Loge responds with chord notes in a line that continues over his rising scale. Like Wotan before him, the fire god's vocal appears merely to dance on tonic notes, but countering Wotan's accusation, it launches syntactically on a rising triad, sign of betrayal and abandonment, to descend a dangerous fifth, in its finish on an inversion of Wotan's immediately prior lusting module. After another 2 measures of the Erde chord note tremolo, Loge sings atop its dancing major-minor flicker, again supplemented by a cadential measure, as he implies it was the immortal alone who sealed that unfortunate pact. The fire god's tonic vocal tracing the heroic melody notes in the form of a high ash interval, to plunge a fifth, rise a third, meaning a coy, lusting retrograde, and finish on melody notes, launched through a low ash interval. The fire god's words repeat a truth both Fasolt and Wotan himself have amply confirmed by appeal to the law runes on the god's spear, never mind Wotan's status as head of his divine clan. A delicately mocking pulse of Valhalla Part 1 floats on first-second horns beneath an octavo violin tremolo pedal to announce Loge's following arietta. Vocally, he begins by defending his peregrinations, leaping up a fourth to then follow the downward string chromatics of his chord note module for 2 measures capped by reverse chord notes. After a second Valhalla pulse in delicate woodwinds over octavo string tremolo, he disavows any interest in Haus und Herd. His vocal again conformed to the string's descending chord note module, which he finishes with more reversed chord notes. Legato high woodwinds, doubled in violin demi-semiquavers punctuate his assertion with more Valhalla syntax, this time leading Part 1's initial fragment, meaning comprised of racially charged Welterb triads, with two variants on Part 3's air-to-chord pulses, the last on the rising third of its whirl-dash interval, which then lifts another third to create an abandonment triad. The whole cell bundle hints at the earth goddess behind the fire god's dissimulations, never mind his resentment for the fortress's imprisonment of her natural powers. After an a cappella measure singing a triplet that rises a third to fall a sixth, pizzicato strings toy with these air-to-chords, as Loge makes the odd comment that Donner and Fro denken an Dach und Fach wollen sie freien, a quip set to a variant of Albrecht's own wooing phrase. Initiated and capped by reverse chord notes, he continues the idea with chagrin, which, after a coy semiquaver rest, he completes on a plunging octave, whose double impact on ein Haus subtly calls to mind the giant's outrage, while also making that cell the direst of inverted ash intervals. Followed by another altered woodwind pulse of air-to-chords simulating Valhalla Part 3, its finish again capped with an abandonment triad. With it, the fire god reminds the immortals it's this which they must have for their romancing to prosper, sung to, of all things, Flosshilda's warning for her sisters, with its implication of poor stewardship. Loge's flippant evaluation of the gods' two eligible bachelors, with their hopes for consorts, floats on that quasi-recitative style meant to highlight its words. In doing so, it reveals an elephant in the room analysis has never grappled. The mythology pays a great deal of attention to divine couplings with the non-godly, whose Aesir and Vanir gods often have sexual relations with other races. Lacking Wotan, the fire sprite, and Erda, Wagner winnows his immortals down to a pair of males and females. Fricka is Wotan's consort, and Freya is her sister, while both are sisters to Donner and Fro, and we learn in Valkyr of Fricka's loathing for incest. If the two male gods ever hope to freien, therefore it must be outside their race. The unspoken subtext of Loge's comment, then, is that any new generation of immortals can only spring from marriage with the non-divine. As suggested by veiled hints in Wotan's prior exchange with Fricka, whose import becomes clear in Valkyrie, the king of the gods is already deeply involved in that business. But it's a fool's game, as Loge's use of Flosshilda's accusing Morpheme confirms, along with his citation of Albrecht. The immortals are by definition poor stewards of their race. His fertile jibe initiates a subtle key change from the A major dominating this, his first appearance, into D flat, along with triple time, a shift prepared beneath his Flosshilda module by Valhalla's air-to-chords and abandonment triad. Three-string chord double impact developments of Fasold's outrage over being denied Freya shift from major to minor, then back, Erda's harmonic trademark, to separate the fire god's three phrases, as he reminds Wotan such a place is the father god's dearest wish. To underline the Vala's influence, Loge's vocal outlines three melody note strophes, the last capped with the downward fifth to underline its chagrin, followed by a rising air to fourth. Yet another contradiction in retrograde of Wotan's lusting module. This leads to the core of his arietta, which, it should be noted, has already firmly diverted the subject from Freya's ransom to instead stress the castle's vital importance to the male gods for their own reproductive futures, the precariousness of their situations very much like that of Fasold and Freya. The fire sprite doubles down on his change of subject by ticking off a building inspection report in some detail, with much praise for the giant's work. His voice rides on a drastically abbreviated procession of Valhalla morphemes, recalling those at Scene 2's beginning, here with bassoons supported by horns as the only brass, their lines doubled by light tremolo strings, an irreverent frisky sound. The passage consists of 2 full Valhalla Part 1 strophes, 2 Part 1 variants, their static ash intervals equally airy on clarinet English horn, followed by a Part 1 variant which hints at its cadence bundle without reproducing it. Outside disjointed reference to its several parts, Valhalla doesn't sound again with this degree of completeness until the final scene of Rheingold, as if, in describing it, the fire god makes it irrelevant. Loge's vocal, his phrases regularly separated by rests, begins on a falling triad, a hint of the god's racial aspirations, which he immediately chides by echoing it with the retrograde of the final heroic melody notes. His next phrase bounces down, then up thirds, into reverse chord notes, following it bouncing down a fourth, and up a merry sixth to repeat the heroic melody note inversion. After a dotted crotchet rest, he continues by rising a fourth into an inverted ash interval on a fourth, then leap up a minor third into a reverse on chord notes, and after a few static notes and an upward third, extended reverse melody notes. It's worth noting this praise for the castle is heavily dominated by the more compromised ash intervals, as well as reversals of prime errata syntax, and in Comium the fire god concludes, not surprisingly, with a bundle of familiar Valhalla modules, here arranged in a particularly enlightening way. This seems an uncomplicated and thoroughly expected repetition of Valhalla's Part 3 and 4, but subtle if telling changes make it unique. For one, Loge concludes Fasolt's name by launching a static ash interval which leads it to Fafnir's, on which he falls an octave, a succinct précis of the fire sprite's evaluation of their respective worth. For another, Loge offers one of the tetralogy's few instances in which Freya's love module sounds vocally, the last until Valkyr, as, after leaping up a third and down a pleasant sixth, he sings the very words that confirm beyond any doubt the giants have fulfilled their contractual duties. Then, following Part 3's iteration of the pure ash interval on its wanted rising third, this pulse of Valhalla cadence ash interval takes an upward sixth in deference to Wotan's racial aspirations, while sounding over the spear exactly as it does when Wotan defends against Fricka his right to extramarital dalliance. It's worth remarking, the fire sprite's vocal follows the ash interval's pitches while carefully eschewing its syncopation. Fortifying this emphasis, the accompanying orchestra goes quiet, as it allows an oboe to intone both world ash interval and Freya, supported only by a soft minim horn chord and cheeky pizzicato violin punctuation. This delicately shifted variant of the cadence, along with its indications of Loge's quite different take on the gods and their aspirations, also points to the work's greatest mystery, meaning the resolution of all its conflicts. But like so many details in this complex work, the Meister reserves explication for a time when he's clarified everything leading up to it. For now, one need only grasp Loge's Valhalla testimony is no point of digression, but a key element in the trap closing on the gods. Loge cuts from under Wotan's feet another possible plea, that of bad workmanship, a common defense in building contracts. Concluding his report, the key returns to A major, while shifting back to duple-time, and Loge's chord note module slides down violoncellos for 2 measures, repeats 2 of its pulses, rises from them on 2 measures of its chromatic scale, one of countless interesting sonic flourishes that productions never seem to notice or utilize to characterize the offhand actions of the fire god. Loge says he hasn't been nusig or lesig, descending an errata fourth into a cappella static notes that rise a third into string pizzicati quavers on each beat. In the midst of 2 echoing reverse chord note phrases and falling third, he sings Der Lucht on a rising fourth, for he's certainly been busy on Erda's behalf to the immortal's grief, falling into the echo on chord notes proper and another fourth. This dualism brackets his needle at the god's own laziness, another sly hint of his sympathy for the industrious giants as Erda's creatures. Second violin slide up a measure's Loge chromatics, its launching syncopation making it a kind of retrograde spear over a viola-cello tremolo to spark Wotan's annoyance, who first claims he sees through this trick, a static ash interval in his voice ended by the heroic cell atop another scale tremolo figure ending in a measure of Loge's sinking chord notes. He warns the fire god not to play him false, his voice outlining a pair of chagrin strophes, the last capped by reverse chord notes, all of it supported by the scale tremolo figure repeating twice, first on one measure of cellos, then violas, whose rise doubles into two. Wotan points out he's Loge's only friend amongst the gods, voice rising a fourth into a reverse ash interval on reverse chord notes that fall a fourth as strings outline an odd, almost friendly chordal version of Loge's morpheme. Strings continue on gentle semibreve pedal chords as the god vaguely echoes his previous phrase, this time lifting a minor third into another reverse ash interval. This, he concludes, sinking a fourth to rise in melody notes. His vocal then echoes more tenuously still, leaping up a minor third into a static ash interval that sinks on reverse melody spear notes in what might almost be resignation, all to stress the fire sprite's precarious status in the immortal tribe. Two cello measures of Loge's scintillating chord note tremolo answers the immortal, a sonic image of the fire god's silent bristle at these veiled threats. With the rising triad and falling tritone sung a cappella, a clear threat of abandonment, the god orders him to speak wisely, and octavo low strings, quietly but decisively, reply with the spear, leaving no doubt Wotan means what he says and has the power to enforce it. The morpheme's last note lingers on a dotted semibreve pedal, which extends across another semibreve to end on a last dotted minim, thus outlining reverse melody notes, while the god indicts Loge's part in the bad bargain with a low ash interval on an Erda fourth, followed by melody notes and reverse chord notes. Falling another fourth on Freya, his vocal leaps up a third to conclude on chord notes, the whole vocal opposing the spear's reverse melody note elongation. Wotan intuiting that Loge's behavior threatens his racial hopes. Woodwind's counter rambling carelessly down a measure of Loge's chord note cell, a puckish sonic image of the fire god's nonchalance. But Wotan persists, reminding his friend the god accepted this deal only because Loge swore zu lösen das Heerer Fand. The entire exchange between Wotan and his fiery chum has been like an aside the two parties don't wish the other immortals to hear, much less the giants, and this final vocal is amongst the leanest in Rheingold. Begun a cappella by tracing heroic melody notes in a halting fashion separated by a crotchet rest, Wotan then falls a third, rests a quaver, and proceeds with three static notes ended in chord notes on a dotted crotchet cello chord. After another quaver rest with only two more cello punctuations, he sings five more static pitches, rises in melody notes, only to sink a third into another six static notes, a marcato on the first syllable of lösen. The spare vocal's punchline, however, is its payoff, as he identifies what's to be rescued, the Heerer Fand, sung to an embryonic pulse of fate. The effect of this passage, compassing Wotan's threats, is totally cinematic, each of them met by one of Loge's sonic gestures, as if cross-cutting back and forth from the god's warnings to the fire sprite's silent, nonplussed reactions. Three cut-time measures of Loge's reversed chord note ascent preface the fire god's reply, who meets these charges with a very different view of the situation. Mit höchster Sorg drauf zu sinnen, wie es zu lösen, das hab ich gelobt. His accompaniment, no more than a spare group of punctuating quaver string chords, leaves no doubt his text is crucial to understanding the work's hard narrative, which his hasty but equally scant vocal edifies only with 2 reverse ash intervals on chord notes, the first capped by a falling third, the second a rising one. He concatenates this into a swift pair of falling, rising thirds, followed by chord notes separated with a semi-quaver rest. The following dotted crotchet pause before he sings Hab ich gelobt expresses both the thought and the vocal's cadential movement on a falling fourth ended by reverse chord notes, which gives the impression of an enfeebled strophe whose charge of defiance is compromised by Loge's sense of his own culpability. Out of this defense, cello's violas rise through a measure and a half of his scalar module into a measure of his tremolos, at which point its magic fire bundle takes over. Multiple divisi violins with high woodwinds support intoning its air to chords. With it, Loge calls this a problem for which no solution exists, his voice prancing through a chagrin distortion, capped by a plunging fifth to rise on extended melody notes. After a semiquaver rest, he rises on a pair of reverse chord notes, separated by the lift of a third. This brief passage adds suspense as it tails out in a surging crescendo by rising chromatically on a harmonic distortion of the giant's accusations, complete with its sense of betrayal. Low woodwinds grumble out of the following ominous crotchet of silence by intoning an unmistakable air to chord pulse. Then Loge concludes on a payoff to outdo Wotan. He asks who would ever promise such a thing, to a low ash interval, finished by an extended version of the heroic cell, appropriately cramped by rising only a third. In this way, for a second time in only a few minutes, the fire god throws the onus back on the immortal and his fellows, who look rashly gullible in the face of this universal truth. Not surprisingly, they leap in with abuse for Loge, a brief acrimonious spat based entirely on Loge syntax, predominantly on middle and low strings, punctuated by horns, low woodwinds. 2 cello-viola measures slither up his scale, capped by second violas in a semi-quaver arpeggio, flagged as demi-semi-quavers resembling the giant-related figure, as it has twice punctuated the spear, only to fall on 2 measures of chord notes, which Fricka's taunt mirrors vocally in a descending chromatic scale ended by reverse chord notes. With the next 2 scalar measures, Fro cries a static ash interval, descends a fifth, then, after furious static notes, leaps up a third to sing the word Luge on a plunging fourth. This triggers 2 hectic measures of chord note tremolos, with Donner's highly tonic threats racing through a pair of Rheinmaiden taunts separated by bouncing fourths, whose relevance is his sexual frustration embodied in their falling triads, each capped with heroic rising fifths. Loge defends himself over 2 measures of another strophe of Magic Fire rising chromatically, an iteration closely related to that which underscores his confession that no alternative ransom for Freya exists. After rising on reverse chord notes and a third, he falls on the chord notes themselves, and another third to finish with a weak chromatic pulse of chagrin on a feeble third. Octavo contrabasses. Cellos cap this interval by rushing furiously up sextuplet semiquavers through a half measure of his chromatic scale, joined in a second measure by violas, stage directions calling for Donner to aim a blow at the fire sprite. The horn woodwind pedal chord buttressing this sonic rage relaxes, however, as Wotan steps up in his beleaguered crony's defense. By doing so, he introduces one of the tetralogy's more controversial morphemes. It begins with, and seems to consist entirely of, bare-bones quasi-recitative. Wotan's vocal moves from a static ash interval into melody notes, answered in strings by a rising staccato arpeggio resembling the giant's material, a suggestion of what Wotan believes is the target of Loge's cunning. The god's responsive vocal thus inverts the cell, also a subtle hint of the ring fragment, and makes of its conclusion that merrily lustful figure shared by Albrecht and the Rhine maidens, strings answering with another giant strophe. In this way, Wotan triggers a new and analytically contentious morpheme. While the god's vocal is busy with syntax, the accompanying strings simply outline a consecutive octavo pair of descending sevenths, harmonized in thirds, the second a third below the first. Volkswagen doesn't even notice this module until its first occurrence in Scene 3, and relies on its later prominence in Siegfried for his moniker Thoughtfulness. Kobe pays the morpheme no mind, but Newman follows Volkswagen's lead without bothering to name the syntax. Hutcheson makes no mention of its origin in Rheingold and calls it reflection, but Holman grasps it initiates in Rheingold and calls it Loge's craft, even though his example shows Wotan's melody line alone, a form in which the syntax never recurs. Like Hutcheson, Sabor recognizes it only in Siegfried and names it brooding. Of all his fellows, Cook spends the most time on it, dubs it scheming, and with a special example shows how it derives from the ring. Oddly, he's nonetheless in tacit agreement with the majority of his colleagues, who don't connect it with Loge syntactically, though by the rules of opera and drama it must apply only to the fire god's powers, since its entire context refers specifically to the unique, if dubious, merits of Loge's advice. Neither does Cook recognize its central interval, the falling seventh, not surprisingly, since he ascribes that to women's inspiration and makes no connection between Loge and Erda. While the morpheme doesn't enjoy the prominence of much of the epic's syntax, in bringing together the various conceptual threads separately unearthed by diverse analysts, in my view it points to the work's central thesis. This problematic morpheme leapfrogs Valkyrie entirely, since the forevermore offstage fire god exerts his covert influence over the immortals' developing plans by means different from his Valsongs and the Valkyrie pivotal to their fates. Nonetheless, it spreads its message across the tetralogy's other 3 chapters. That fact alone confirms its deep influence on the narrative, a clandestine force the poem's wording emphasizes. Reicher wiegt seines Rates Wert, saut zögernd hinaus. The morpheme's falling seventh implies Erda as the ultimate source of such guidance, while its harmonic basis in the ring implies a direct connection between the Earth Mother, Loge, the ring's genesis, and its reason for existing, meaning as a tool furthering Erda's plans. Finally, the poem suggests this Zögern extends well beyond Rheingold, with the implication even the gods themselves don't and can't know its full extent. It's not inapt that Holman's example cites Wotan's syntax-heavy vocal, whose modules add the immortal quality to its equation. The god sings a reverse ash interval on the figure's initial downward seventh, rises from it in that fragment's low version, its ascending interval, an ominous tritone. Wotan follows with yet another reverse interval, complete with downward seventh, to precisely mirror the first. Ending the idea symmetrically, he continues with yet a third low ash interval, whose intensely hopeful upward span is an octave, an idea he contemplates on a distortion of Freya's love cell. Loge himself has only just praised the giant's labors to the love goddess's module, and, in so doing, pulls Wotan deeper into Erda's trap. The immortal's echo of his accomplice's indictment is a sign Wotan believes Loge uses his cunning to rescue the goddess, thus paradoxically indicting himself, his entire vocal built on morphemes which reinforce the idea nature's powers are compromised by their imprisonment in Valhalla. Had Newman recognized scheming here in Rheingold, he no doubt would have said it reinforces his oft-stated opinion the Meister flings his syntax about inconsistently, attaching to others the guile which it imputes to the fire god alone, thus negating the work's morphemic system by sounding its elements in no credible narrative context. This morpheme, however, is an object lesson in the difference between Newman's view of the Meister's syntax and how Wagner in fact deploys it. If it's merely a flag of generic cunning, it's truly out of place, both here and in all its subsequent appearances. But, as the poetic text makes clear, it signals nothing but Loge's sly ability to manipulate others. It doesn't portray Wotan as crafty, nor suggest anything like generic cunning, but rather telegraphs the fire sprite's persuasion at work, not merely on the giants but the god himself. Squirming in his box seat, Krebel's doubter whispers, "Loge really has that Wotan guy conned." Exactly as scheming manipulates the world's most powerful entity, from this moment forward it signals Loge's mental control over those other characters it's necessary for him to influence, Mima foremost amongst them, in order that Erda's designs for the world should bear her desired fruit. If an error must be laid at Wagner's door, it's that he sounds the morpheme too infrequently, repeating it only a handful of times in Rheingold, then not at all during Valhalla. When it returns in Siegfried, its fragile associative magic has worn off, hence the confusions discussed. Since its harmony derives from the ring, Koch believes it connotes only Nibelung efforts to retrieve that cursed talisman. With his fellow analysts, he's unaware that Erda and Loge see to it the ring is created for the main purpose of bringing down Wotan. Scheming's genesis, therefore, invests it with potent irony, since the immortal's defense clears the way for the fire god to launch his panegyric, during which he dangles the lure which finally snares Wotan. After leaving the unsuspecting gods no doubt that all other options are futile, Loge inspires their unquenchable lust for the ring. They think he plays the giants, but the fire god also maneuvers the entire immortal clan into Erda's trap. Spurred by a chromatic viola-cello semiquaver uprush, the giants finally lose patience with all this chatter and atop giant thumps on wanted low strings, their tonic-dominant tonic rhythm in the horn-bassoon ensemble. Fafnir demands their overdue wage with 2 static ash intervals, at a parallax to their presence in the thumps, and separated in his vocal by a plunging octave. Fasold echoes the sentiment, but less emphatically with a descending fifth and rising minor third. The orchestra's reply is an odd Loge variant to portray Wotan's mounting anxiety. First violins mingling the chromatically ascending scale on semiquaver triplets with opposing viola-cello semiquaver reverse chord note signs. The mix slithers up 2 chromatic measures and ends with 2 sforzando semibrevi chords and a dotted minim supporting the god's order that Loge explain his long absence, a vocal begun with an inverted ash interval on a tritone, to rise then fall in opposing triads, the first launched with a low ash interval, the last resembling his Loge defense, with its ring fragment and passionate bounce. It's a concise bundle of the sexual tensions raised by the fire god's machinations over the fate of Valhalla, the immortal's lust to rescue it, and Wotan's readiness to abandon Loge should he fail them. The god isn't quite finished, though. He caps his demand by paraphrasing Loge's mysterious perambulations which have kept him so long from the immortal's much-needed rescue, singing Hin und Her on a falling syncopated third, capped by a heroic rising fifth. What's more, the forceful string chords fall silent on a minim rest of 2 crotchets, giving special weight to this final distinctive a cappella flourish in the god's voice. Seemingly non-syntactic, it closely resembles the god's praise for his new-built citadel's powers. Wotan ultimately hopes that somewhere in this Hin und Her the fire god has discovered the solution to immortal woes. Indeed, Loge has, but not at all in the way they expect. and this syncopated falling third followed by a rising fifth is in truth embryonic syntax first rooted in Flosshilda's warning, then developed by Alberich's Scene 1 fury against the Rhine maidens. Since then, its emergent module has sounded in passing several times, most notably during Wotan's encomium to Valhalla, and comes to represent the force of the unseen solution to Wotan's impasse with the giants, as well as its ultimate cost, an idea only gradually becoming clear to the god at the same time it does to an audience. Loge responds by feigning distress over all this ingratitude with another slyly mocking quasi-recitative. Crotchet string chords marching softly beneath him, two to a measure off the beat, in a pair of spear lines, doubles these vocally with two phrases echoing in the way of an old-fashioned song. The first ended with a reverse ash interval descending a fifth, the second launched tellingly by a rising octave, then moving through two reverse chord note phrases. In this way, he stealthily inaugurates the backstory of his futile search for a ransom whose vast scope, alle Winkel der Welt, by singing after Erde chord notes another echoing pair, the first contradicting the spear motion with extended melody notes, the second their hyperextension. Appropriately, the drop of a fourth between the two lines creates a chagrin pulse, followed by Alberich's defiance, a syntactic mix reversing one already heard several times in Wotan's lines, to underline the immortal's duplicity. Violins cut him short, racing up his chromatic scale to break off as quickly. Syncopated viola-cello chords become winsome if neutral semi-breathy minim pedals, as he describes what he's been seeking, his Welt-Arab triad followed by melody notes, capped with a descending fifth, an interesting opposition of Fricka's accusing module and chagrin, which bundle is a more prominent vocal trait of his during Scene 3. It's the same he's only just reversed, in contrast to Wotan's earlier use of it, suggesting how much the immortal relies on the fire god's influence, which Loge now turns back on Wotan himself. Then, intoned on one repeated pitch, he pointedly identifies the alternate ransom as one den Riesen wohl recht. Words emphasized by sinking through chord notes into an embryonic vocal pulse of fate. After the string crotchet punctuating this phrase, a fermata on the following crotchet rest allows its import to sink in. The fire god has effectively announced that not the gods, but Loge and the giants have the upper hand, thus by inference all nature, with Erde at its heart, an idea to dominate the fire god's coming panegyric. The string chords now pizzicati, he attests he's searched all creation on ironic reversed chord notes, a downward fourth traded for a rising fifth, another fourth, and more reverse chord notes, rising a fourth into a reverse ash interval on chord notes with the words in der Welten Ring, pizzicati string quavers change to arco for more emphasis. They swell in volume on two additional crotchets as he goes on to say he has found no replacement on pallid repeated notes and a drooping third. He continues the thought more stoutly and a cappella with extended melody notes, this time launched more hopefully by a low ash interval, a phrase punctuated by a forte string crotchet, this mini-climax leading to one of the epic's notable syntactic evolutions. Loge shifts the resignation morpheme from its embryonic form on Fricka's lips to its definitive, the syntax's conceptual basis less about trading love for loveless power than with the long-term effects of that trade. Given the decisive role both Fricka and Loge play in its genesis, never mind the fire god's comments which it climaxes, the morpheme is clearly basic to nature, though with dark import. One of its greatest ironies is its close similarity to the spear, even suggesting that morpheme's initial rhythmic pulse, while also built on double reverse melody note pulses with their emergent racial implications. From the moment it sounds definitively on Loge's lips, resignation connotes the bitterness of emotional loss due to alienation from the natural feminine principle. The connection to Wotan's spear is obvious, since the god's crime, theft of his weapon, fatally alienates him from the ultimate feminine, the Earth Mother Erda, while effectively enslaving two of her primal feminine embodiments, meaning Fricka and Freya. That event is all too familiar to Loge, of course, and the remarkable ode immediately following it includes both his reaction and his solution. Volzogut, Kobe, and Newman are apparently unaware of this crucial syntactic landmark, at least as it occurs to kick off Loge's panegyric, a passage about which they've otherwise a good deal to say. Hutcheson does recognize it, though refers to it cautiously, only as a variant of the motive of renunciation, a notion Cook seconds. Holman dubs the morpheme woman's worth, based on its text, then gives the most detailed elucidation of the syntax found in those commentaries I cite. Spencer Millington seem unaware of it, but Sabor dubs it Liebe tragique. First and third horns support its line with a partial doubling of the fire god's vocal, English horns slyly contradicting them with the melody notes themselves. The module's harmonization, a single embedded Erda chord pulse, is how it's almost universally heard, though with all 6 descending melody notes in thirds, as with its vocal form here. It dovetails seamlessly into Loge's panegyric. But that's for the next video, which picks up where this one leaves off in Dober's full score on the first stave of page 121. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do all I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.